3 bullets, 1 unconscious soldier, and a surgeon so convinced of his own brilliance that he was about to make the 4th wound himself. In the trauma room at Harlow Memorial Hospital, Nurse Mara Weston stood 2 feet from the table, watching the attending surgeon prepare a cut that would kill the man bleeding in front of them. She had seen that injury pattern before, not in any textbook, in a field dressing station 300 miles behind enemy lines, with artillery shaking the ground under her boots. She said it once, clearly. He laughed at her. 40 seconds later, she had to decide whether to stay quiet and let a decorated soldier die, or blow up the only life she'd rebuilt. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I release stories like this every week, and you do not want to walk in at the end. Drop a like if this opening already has you tense, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The night shift at Harlow Memorial Hospital started the same way it almost always did, with a broken coffee machine, a missing chart, and someone from the day team leaving without finishing their notes. Mara Weston dropped her bag in the break room locker, pulled her dark hair back with the kind of efficiency that took no thought at all, and checked the board. 2 post-op observations, 1 incoming chest pain from triage, 1 pediatric fever that had already been seen and was just waiting on labs. Quiet enough to be suspicious. She had learned early in her career not to trust quiet nights. They were just loud nights that hadn't started yet. "Board looks light," said Donna Kessler from the nurse's station, not looking up from her screen. Donna was 61, had been at Harlow for 22 years, and had the deeply resigned energy of someone who had seen every version of every problem and was no longer surprised by any of them. "Enjoy it, it won't last." "It never does," Mara said, and picked up the nearest chart. Harlow Memorial sat at the edge of Caldwell City, a mid-sized port city on the southern coast that had seen better decades. The hospital served the whole eastern corridor, fishing communities, shipping workers, a military installation 20 miles north at Fort Aldrin that generated a steady trickle of referrals. The trauma bay was one of the better-equipped ones in the region, which wasn't saying much, but it was something. Mara had been at Harlow for 3 years. Before that, she had been somewhere else entirely. Several places, in fact, none of which she talked about at work. She was 44, looked somewhere in her late 30s, depending on the lighting, and had the kind of physical stillness that people sometimes mistook for disinterest. She wasn't disinterested. She was just very good at watching without letting people know she was watching. It was a habit she'd developed out of professional necessity and never fully managed to put down. Her official record at Harlow listed 12 years of nursing experience, a trauma certification, and a gap between 2009 and 2016 that read simply as prior medical service. Nobody had ever asked her to elaborate, and she had never volunteered anything. The administration liked her because she showed up on time, kept meticulous documentation, and never caused drama. The other nurses liked her because she covered shifts and knew when to be funny and when to stay quiet. The doctors had a more complicated relationship with her, which mostly meant they liked that she anticipated their needs and didn't like when she pushed back. She pushed back less than she used to. She had made a deliberate choice about that years ago. The pager went off at 11:14, Level 1, Trauma. GSW, multiple, ETA 4 minutes. Mara was already moving before the announcement finished over the intercom. The trauma bay at Harlow was a wide rectangular room with 4 bays separated by curtains, overhead lighting that was too bright and slightly greenish, and the persistent smell of antiseptic and something underneath it that antiseptic never quite covered. Mara had long since stopped noticing it. She pulled gloves from the dispenser, checked the crash cart, confirmed the airway tray was stocked, and looked up as 2 paramedics pushed through the double doors with a gurney moving fast. The man on it was big, over 6 feet, built wide through the shoulders, dressed in civilian clothes that had been cut open by the paramedics. His skin was pale from blood loss, sheened with sweat, and his oxygen saturation was reading 84 on the transport monitor. 3 entry wounds, 1 in the right shoulder, 1 in the lateral chest, 1 lower, in the abdomen on the left side. The abdominal one was the one Mara looked at first. The pattern of the wounds told her something. She didn't say it yet. She listened to the paramedic relay. Marcus Doe, unidentified, approximate mid-40s, found at the Aldrin Access Road, no ID on scene. 3 GSWs, BP was 80/50 on arrival. We pushed 2 liters normal saline. Pressure came up to 94/60. Responsive to pain on scene. Lost consciousness about 2 minutes ago. What position was he found in? Mara asked. The paramedic glanced at her. Prone, face down in the ditch. She nodded once and didn't say anything else because Dr. Garrison Holt had walked in. Garrison Holt was the senior trauma attending at Harlow Memorial, and he knew it the way some people know they're the tallest person in a room, constantly, and with a specific kind of satisfaction. He was 52, clean-shaved, expensive watch visible below his left glove cuff, even in the trauma bay, which Mara had always thought was an interesting choice. He moved with the authority of someone who expected people to physically step back when he entered a space, and usually they did. "What do we have?" he said. Not a question, exactly. More of a statement that expected an answer. Mara gave him the summary in 12 seconds. Vitals, mechanism, wound locations, current pressure. Holt was already at the patient's side, gloved, doing his own assessment. His fingers pressed along the abdomen. Tension pneumothorax. That chest wound's the priority. We're going to decompress and then open the chest. Mara looked at the abdominal wound. She looked at the patient's hands. Then at his neck, at a specific scar just below the right jaw, thin and deliberate, at a faded mark on his left forearm that wasn't decorative, at the way his muscle structure was built, not gym built, which looked different, but load-bearing built, the kind that came from years of carrying weight across uneven ground. Her jaw tightened. "Dr. Holt," she said, keeping her voice level. "I think the abdominal wound may be the primary bleed. The BP response to the saline was shallow. It came up, but not enough. That could indicate intra-abdominal hemorrhage. If we open the chest first..." "He's showing signs of tension pneumo," Holt said, without looking at her. "Deviated trachea, decreased breath sounds on the left. We follow the protocol." The tracheal deviation is minimal, and his abdomen is rigid. Holt did look at her then. It was a brief look, the kind that lasted exactly long enough to communicate that the conversation was over. "Thank you, Nurse Weston. I've got it from here." There was a resident in the corner, a third-year named Pollard, who had the expression of someone watching something they couldn't quite name. The scrub tech didn't look up. Donna was at the edge of the bay and didn't move. Mara stepped back. Not far. She kept her position at the head of the gurney, where she was managing the airway, which was her job and a legitimate reason to stay exactly where she was. She watched Holt. He was competent. She had never questioned that. He was fast, technically precise, and he knew the protocols cold. The chest decompression was clean. Needle in, the hiss of air, the patient's oxygen saturation began to climb. It went from 84 to 91. Holt called for the thoracotomy tray. "Pressure?" he said. 98/62, Pollard read. "Good. We're going in." Mara looked at the abdomen again. The pressure hadn't come up enough. 98 was better than 80, but for a man that size with that build, compensating the way his body was compensating, it wasn't right. It was the number of someone whose body was working very hard to stay alive and was about to run out of the ability to do it. She thought about what she was going to do. She thought about the last time she had pushed back hard in a clinical setting and what had happened afterward. Not here, before here, in a different life. She thought about the 3 years she had spent building a quiet, unremarkable record at Harlow. She thought about the fact that Garrison Holt had friends on the hospital board and had never, in her memory, been wrong about anything out loud. Then she looked at the man on the table, at his hands, at that scar below his jaw. She had seen that scar before, that specific placement, that specific angle, twice, on 2 different people. Both of them had been in the same unit. She knew what that meant. "Dr. Holt," she said, "I need you to hold." The room went very still. Holt didn't stop moving. "Nurse Weston, his abdomen is guarding. The rigidity has increased in the last 90 seconds. I need you to palpate the left lower quadrant before you open the chest." "I am in the middle of..." "Please." The word came out quiet and completely without deference. It wasn't a request, it was a warning delivered in the grammar of a request. 30 seconds. Holt set down the instrument in his hand with a deliberateness that communicated exactly how much patience he was extending. He moved to the abdomen, pressed. His expression didn't change, but his hand stilled. He pressed again. "Abdomen is firm," Pollard said, unnecessarily. Holt straightened. "We continue with the chest. If he's bleeding into his abdomen, then we'll address it when we're finished with the life-threatening pneumothorax." Holt picked the instrument back up. "Step back, nurse. Leave the medicine to the people who went to medical school." The resident looked at the wall. The scrub tech looked at the floor. Mara stood at the head of the gurney. She watched the patient's monitor. Blood pressure, 96/60. Heart rate, 112 and climbing. The oxygen sat was holding at 94 since the decompression. Holt made the first incision. She watched the blood pressure drop. 88/54. It happened fast, faster than it should have, even for a chest opening, which always caused some hemodynamic shift. Faster than the blood volume explained. 81/48. The monitor alarm triggered at the same moment that Holt said something under his breath that she didn't catch, and then louder. "He's bleeding out. Get me suction." 74/40. "Pressure's crashing," Pollard said, voice climbing. "I can see that." 69/37. Mara moved. She didn't ask. She didn't announce it. She stepped to the side of the table, put one hand on Holt's arm. Not hard, just firm enough to shift him. And with her other hand, she pressed into the left lower quadrant of the abdomen, where she had been looking for the last 8 minutes. "There," she said. "He's got an arterial bleeder in the mesentery. The chest wound is secondary. The pressure drop isn't from the thoracotomy. He was already compensating for an intra-abdominal hemorrhage, and the positional shift when you opened him broke whatever tamponade he had." Holt stared at her. "Get your hands off my patient." "Get me a laparotomy tray," she said, to the scrub tech. And the scrub tech, God bless him, Mara thought, and then immediately corrected herself. Just moved. Because he'd heard her voice and it left no room for interpretation. "Weston." Holt's voice had dropped to something dangerous. "You are a nurse. You do not have surgical privileges in this hospital. If you make one cut—" "I'm not going to cut anything," she said, already palpating for the bleeder through the abdominal wall. "I'm going to hold pressure while you decide whether you want to save him or be angry. You can do both, but not at the same time." The blood pressure hit 62/31. The room made a collective decision. Pollard moved to assist. The scrub tech had the tray open. One of the nurses, Lynette, who Mara had worked with for 2 years, started drawing up vasopressors without being asked. Holt stepped back. Not gracefully. Not with any kind of acknowledgement. He just stepped back, the way a man steps away from something he doesn't want to be associated with if it goes wrong. Mara didn't look at him. She called it as she worked. Not loudly, just clearly, the way she used to call it in conditions where clarity was the only thing between people and catastrophe. "I need 2 large bore IVs if we don't have them. Start the massive transfusion protocol, O negative until we have a type and cross. Vasopressors, as we discussed. I need the OR notified. We are going to need a vascular surgeon in the next 15 minutes, and whoever is on call needs to be physically in this building, not en route." "Who are you?" Pollard said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It came out as a genuine question. "Weston, Trauma 1, Bay 2. "I'm listed on the board," she said without looking up. "That's not what I meant." She didn't answer that one. What she was doing wasn't surgery. She was insistent on that fact internally, even as she understood how it looked from the outside. She wasn't cutting. She was applying directed manual compression to a specific anatomical location based on clinical assessment, which was within the scope of advanced trauma nursing in the way that many things were technically within scope and technically unusual to see. She had located the bleeder by feel, not guessing, not hoping, but knowing, because she had done this in conditions where being wrong meant something irreversible, and she held it. The blood pressure began to climb. 70/41. Then 78/49. Then, as the first unit of ONEG went in, 83/55. The alarms quieted one by one. Holt had not left the room. He stood at the edge of the bay, gloved and masked, watching. His expression was the expression of a man cataloging something he did not intend to forget. The OR was ready in 11 minutes. They moved the patient. Mara scrubbed out at the sink in the corridor, working the soap between her fingers the way she had been trained to do when she was 26 years old, in a context that had nothing to do with Harlow Memorial Hospital. Her hands were steady. They always were. She had worked hard to make them that way. Donna appeared beside her at the next sink. "That was something," Donna said. "He's not dead," Mara said. "That's the something." Holt's face was something too. "Donna, I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." Mara turned off the tap with her elbow. "I know." She went back to the board. She finished her notes. She saw the chest pain patient, who turned out to be musculoskeletal and was discharged with instructions. She checked the pediatric labs, which came back negative for anything serious. She drank half a cup of bad coffee from the machine that wasn't broken after all, just inconsistent, which was its own kind of problem. At 2:17 in the morning, Garrison Holt found her, not in a hallway, in the medication room where she was pulling the end-of-shift reconciliation, which was the kind of administrative task that made finding her feel deliberate. He closed the door behind him. She didn't turn around. She kept counting. "What you did tonight was reckless," he said. "You overstepped your scope. You interfered with a physician's active care. I want you to understand that I will be documenting this as a serious clinical incident." "The patient's pressure is stable," she said. "The OR team identified and ligated the mesenteric arterial branch. He's going to make it. That's not the point. It's the point I'm focused on. You are not a surgeon, Weston. You don't have the credentials to make the calls you made tonight. What you did could have killed him just as easily as helped him. You got lucky." She turned around then. She looked at him for a moment without saying anything. "Document whatever you need to document," she said. "That's your right, but I'd recommend you document it accurately." "Is that a threat?" "It's a suggestion." She went back to the count. "Good night, Dr. Holt." He left. She heard the door, not slammed. Holt was too controlled for slamming, but closed in a way that communicated everything a slam would have. She finished the count. She was off by 1 milligram of something, found the discrepancy, corrected it, and signed her name to the form. At 6:15 in the morning, as her shift was ending, the charge nurse told her that Dr. Holt had filed an incident report and that administration had requested she come in for a meeting that afternoon. She said she would be there. She went home. She slept 4 hours, which was what she usually got. She woke up and made coffee and sat in the small quiet of her apartment and looked out the window at the harbor, where fishing boats were already out and the light was doing what light does over water in the early morning, breaking itself apart into something too complicated to name. She had known, when she stepped into that bay last night, that it was going to cost her something. She had done the math quickly, the way she always did math when the situation required it, factoring the known against the probable, against the acceptable loss. The calculation had come back the same way it always came back in situations like that one. Some things were not a choice. She drank her coffee. She got dressed. She drove back to Harlow Memorial at 2 in the afternoon and went to the administrative conference room on the 3rd floor, where the chief of staff, the nursing director, and Garrison Holt were waiting for her with a folder on the table between them. She sat down. She looked at the folder. She looked at Holt, who was looking at the table with the careful expression of a man who had already decided what was going to happen. The chief of staff, a soft-spoken administrator named Reuben Marsh, who had the energy of someone always managing a headache, opened the folder. "Nurse Weston," he said, "we've reviewed Dr. Holt's incident report and the preliminary clinical record. We want to give you a chance to speak to what happened before we proceed." "I appreciate that," she said. She told them what happened. All of it, in the same order it had occurred, without editorializing and without omitting the part where she had physically redirected the physician. She knew that part was the problem. She was not going to pretend otherwise. When she finished, Marsh looked at the folder again. "The clinical record does show patient stabilization and a positive surgical outcome," he said, carefully. "The clinical record," Holt said, "reflects a collaborative team effort under difficult circumstances. What it doesn't capture is the liability exposure this hospital faces when an unqualified staff member performs unsanctioned interventions during an active procedure. I didn't perform a procedure, must say, Mara said. I applied manual compression. You directed the team. You ordered medications. You called for surgical consult. None of which is outside my scope. In combination, in that context, with your hands inside a patient's abdominal cavity, my hands were not inside the abdominal cavity. That is not how it will read in a deposition. The word landed in the room. Marsh cleared his throat. The nursing director, a woman named Patricia Fell, who had said nothing so far and looked like she didn't intend to start, looked at her own notepad. Nurse Weston, Marsh said, given the severity of the documentation filed, we have to take a preliminary action while this is reviewed. Effective immediately, you're suspended with pay pending a full clinical inquiry. We'll schedule a formal hearing within 2 weeks. Mara looked at him. I understand, she said. Your badge will be temporarily deactivated. Security will escort you out. She looked at Holt. He looked back at her. And for 1 second she saw what was actually there under the controlled expression. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something more particular. The look of someone who has decided that a problem has been solved and can be put away. She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out. The security guard who met her in the hallway was a young man named Terry, who had eaten lunch next to her in the cafeteria maybe 40 times over 3 years. He looked profoundly uncomfortable. It's fine, Terry, she said. I know where the door is. She walked through the emergency department on her way out. It was mid-afternoon, slower than overnight, but not empty. A family in the waiting area, a kid with a wrapped wrist, the sound of a monitor somewhere behind curtain 3. Lynette was at the nurse's station and looked up as Mara passed. Mara gave her a small nod. Lynette pressed her lips together and nodded back. She walked through the sliding doors into the afternoon sun. She had her badge in her hand, still on its lanyard. She looked at it once, her name, her photo, the department designation, and put it in her bag. In the trauma bay on the second floor, behind a glass observation window she wasn't looking at, 2 people stood watching the space she'd just walked out of. They weren't staff. They had badges, but not hospital badges, and they weren't wearing scrubs or suits, just the specific kind of nondescript clothes that people wear when they want to look like they belong somewhere without being part of it. They had arrived at Harlow Memorial at 9 in the morning and spent 5 hours reviewing footage. They had not spoken to anyone on staff. They had not yet identified themselves. They were watching the door through which Mara Weston had just exited, and one of them was writing something in a small notebook, and neither of them looked like they were finished. They were watching the door through which Mara Weston had just exited, and one of them was writing something in a small notebook, and neither of them looked like they were finished. The one with the notebook was a woman, late 30s, with close-cropped hair and the posture of someone who had spent years being told to stand correctly and had finally internalized it. Her name was Special Agent Diane Carell, and she had driven 4 hours from the Regional Defense Department Liaison Office in Trentham because of a single flag that had appeared on a hospital intake system at 11:14 the previous night. The flag was automated. It ran on a federal database that cross-referenced unidentified trauma patients against a set of biometric markers, scar patterns, physical build parameters, physiological indicators, that had been uploaded for a specific list of active and formerly active personnel. The system triggered rarely. When it did, someone like Carell was supposed to go look. She had looked. She had spent the morning reviewing the trauma bay footage from 2 angles, the OR telemetry, the intake record, and the incident documentation that Garrison Holt had filed. She had done all of this quietly, without explaining herself to anyone at the hospital, except to show credentials at the security desk and request access to the administrative review suite on the 3rd floor. Her partner, a man named Specialist Orrin Tague, who said very little and noticed most things, had spent the same morning reviewing the patient's current status in the ICU. They met in the hallway outside the observation window at 2:45, approximately 30 minutes after Mara Weston walked out the front door. She's suspended, Tague said. I saw the paperwork. You see the footage from Bay 2? All of it. Tague was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that was actually the loudest thing about him. It was the quiet of someone compiling information into a conclusion They weren't ready to speak yet. The physician's incident report says she performed an unsanctioned intervention, he said finally. I read it. The footage doesn't support that characterization. No, Carell said. It doesn't. She looked through the observation window at the trauma bay below, now occupied by a different team working a different patient, everything ordinary and procedural and moving the way things moved when nobody was in crisis. How's he doing? She said. Out of surgery 4 hours ago. ICU sedated, but the attending says the surgical repair was clean. Prognosis is good. Tig paused. If she hadn't done what she did, he'd have died on that table. Carell clicked her pen. I know. So what do we do about the nurse? She put the notebook in her jacket pocket. We wait. We let the hospital run whatever process they're running, and we pull everything we can on Weston before that hearing. You think there's something to pull? She thought about the footage, about the way the woman had moved in that trauma bay. Not panicked, not uncertain, not performing competence for an audience. Just doing what needed to be done with the kind of economy that didn't come from textbooks. I think, Carell said carefully, that there is considerably more to Mara Weston than her Harlow Memorial personnel file suggests. She was not wrong. Mara spent the first 2 days of her suspension doing things she was normally too tired to do. She cleaned her apartment, which needed it. She went to the harbor and walked the length of the fishing pier twice, which she used to do more often and had somehow stopped. She bought groceries instead of defaulting to whatever the hospital vending machines had available. She slept 8 consecutive hours on the second night, which felt genuinely strange, like wearing shoes that didn't fit right in a new direction. She did not call anyone from the hospital. A few people called her. Donna, Lynette, one of the newer nurses named Felix, who seemed to be under the impression that moral support should be delivered by text in the form of fire emojis. She responded briefly to each of them. She said she was fine because she mostly was, and she thanked them because their concern was real even if she didn't have a lot of room for it right now. What she was doing, in the quiet of her apartment with coffee going cold on the counter, was thinking. She was thinking about the patient in the ICU, the man she still knew only as whatever alias the intake system had assigned him, the man with 3 bullets in him and a scar below his jaw that she recognized. She was thinking about what she knew and what it implied, and what it would mean if she was right about who he was. She was also thinking about the hearing. The formal clinical inquiry was scheduled for 9 days out. She had been told she could bring representation, which in practice meant a union representative or an attorney. She had a union representative, a tired but capable man named Gordon Chu, who had handled 3 other nursing disputes at Harlow in the past 2 years, and had the demeanor of someone who managed expectations very carefully because he'd been burned by not doing so. She called him on day 3. They've got the incident report from Holt, Gordon said, and they've got a supporting statement from the chief of staff endorsing the documentation. That's 2 management voices saying the same thing. And the patient outcome? Positive outcomes don't insulate you from scope of practice violations. That's the argument they'll make. It doesn't matter that he survived. It matters that you did something you weren't authorized to do. Is that how they'll frame it? That's how they're already framing it. I've seen the preliminary notes. He paused. Mara, I'm going to be honest with you. If this is purely a hospital administrative proceeding, I think we can fight it. But if Holt moves to refer this to the state nursing board, which he can do, and which the language in his report suggests he's considering, we're in a different category of problem. She was quiet. How different? She said. License revocation territory. Not guaranteed, but possible. She had known that. She had known it from the moment she made the call in the trauma bay. She had done the math and had decided the math didn't change the answer. But knowing something abstractly and hearing it stated clearly by a tired man on the phone were 2 different experiences. Okay, she said. Okay, meaning I understand the situation. What do I need to bring to the hearing? Gordon told her. She wrote it down. She thanked him and hung up and sat for a while with the notepad on her knee, looking at the list of documentation she was supposed to gather, and tried to think about what she could actually put in front of a hospital board and what she was never going to be able to explain in that room. On day 4, she got a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She picked up on the fourth ring because something in her, some low-frequency professional habit, said to. Ms. Weston. Not a question. A woman's voice, precise and measured. My name isn't important right now. I'm calling because I've been reviewing the footage from the Harlow Memorial Trauma Bay from the night of the 14th, and I have some questions I'd like to ask you in person. Who are you with? Mara said, a pause that lasted about 1 second too long to be nothing. I'd rather do this in person. I'd rather know who I'm talking to. Another pause. Department of Defense, Contractor Liaison. That's as specific as I'm going to be on an open line. Mara looked at the ceiling. When? She said. Tomorrow. There's a coffee shop on Mercier Street, 11 o'clock. I'll be there, Mara said, and ended the call before the woman could. She sat with the phone in her hand for a while after that. Then she went to bed and slept 5 hours and dreamed about nothing she could remember in the morning, which was the best outcome she usually hoped for. The coffee shop on Mercier Street was the kind of place that had been there for 30 years and looked it. Good coffee, uncomfortable chairs, a regular's table in the back that was always occupied by the same 4 older men, regardless of the time of day. Mara arrived at 10:55 and took a seat facing the door. The woman who came in at 11 on the exact minute was the one with close-cropped hair she'd never seen before and wouldn't have been able to identify from anyone's description, because there was nothing specifically memorable about her except the posture. The man with her was quieter and sat so that he could see both the door and the counter at once, which was either habit or intentional. Carell set her coffee down and didn't waste time. The patient in Harlow ICU, she said. You recognized him. Not a question. I recognized a scar pattern, Mara said. From where? From context I'm not going to discuss in a coffee shop. Carell looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. Fair. Let me ask differently. When you made the clinical call in that trauma bay, redirecting the attending, calling the intervention, was any part of that based on the patient's identity? No, Mara said. It was based on the vitals and the wound pattern. He would have died regardless of who he was. But you knew who he was. I suspected. That's a distinction without a lot of practical difference. It matters to me, Mara said, because what I did, I would have done for anyone on that table. The fact that I recognized him is separate. Teague spoke for the first time. We reviewed the OR telemetry against Holt's incident report. And? They don't match. The report describes a coordinated clinical decision-making process. The footage shows something different. He looked at her steadily. You were the decision-maker. Holt stepped back. That's accurate. That's not what the incident report says. No, Mara said. It's not. She picked up her coffee. It was good. Better than the hospital machine by a significant margin, which set a low bar, but still. What happens to the patient if you don't intervene? Carell said. He dies. The mesenteric arterial bleed was already causing significant volume loss before Holt opened the chest. Once the thoracotomy increased the physiological stress and broke the partial natural tamponade, the hemorrhage would have been unsurvivable without direct intervention. You're certain? I'm not certain of anything. I was certain enough to act. Carell and Teague exchanged a look that communicated something Mara didn't have the context to decode. The hearing is in 8 days, Carell said. I know. We may be in a position to provide testimony, the telemetry, the footage. Why would you do that? Because the patient's identity is classified, and the circumstances of his injury are an active federal matter, and what happened in that trauma bay is relevant to that matter. Carell leaned forward slightly. And because the incident report currently on file is materially false, which creates a problem for us independent of your employment situation. Mara looked at her. I appreciate the heads up, she said, but I'd rather not count on anything I can't guarantee. Smart, Teague said unexpectedly. Don't count on us, but we'll be there. She drove back to her apartment. She spent the afternoon reviewing her own documentation of the night. She had written her own notes separately from the official record. The way she always did, old habit, and comparing it to what Gordon had sent her from the hospital file. The discrepancies in the official record were specific and deliberate, not dramatic. Holt was too careful for dramatic. Just small shifts in language. Team reached consensus instead of attending directed the intervention, responding to attending physician's guidance instead of what the footage actually showed. The kind of alterations that individually could be attributed to imprecise note-taking, but together formed a coherent reframe of the entire event. She sat with that for a while. She had been angry about it, she realized. Not loudly, not in a way that had expressed itself outward, but underneath the practical calculations she'd been running for 4 days, there was a specific and focused anger that she recognized as useful and was careful not to let become something else. On day 6, the patient woke up. She didn't know that immediately. She found out because Donna called her. Officially, people on suspension weren't supposed to receive patient status updates from staff, and Donna knew that, and Donna called anyway. "The GSW from the 14th, Donna said without preamble. "He's awake. He's asking about his care team." "Thank you," Mara said. "There's something else." A pause. Holt went in there, introduced himself as the physician who managed his case. Mara was quiet. "Mara, I heard you. I thought you should know." She thanked Donna again and sat with the phone in her hand for the second time in a week. She didn't go to the hospital. She wasn't supposed to be there, and she wasn't going to create a problem she didn't need to create. But she thought about the man in that ICU room, awake now, with 3 healing wounds and Garrison Holt's name as the first one he'd heard in this context. And she felt something specific and uncomfortable that she didn't have a clean word for. The hearing was in 3 days when Gordon called with new information. "Holt has filed the referral," Gordon said. "State Nursing Board." She had known it was coming. It still landed. "When?" she said. "Yesterday. They'll wait for the hearing outcome before proceeding, but the referral is in. That changes the stakes formally." He paused. "I also heard from someone on the administrative side, off the record. There's external pressure to resolve this quickly. I don't know where it's coming from." She thought about the woman with close-cropped hair and the man who sat facing both the door and the counter. "I think I know," she said. "Are you going to tell me?" "Not yet." He made a sound that communicated resigned professionalism. "The hearing is in 3 days, Mara. If there's something that changes the picture, I need to know before we walk in." "I know," she said. "I'm working on it." She wasn't exactly. There wasn't much to work on. What she had was the truth and her own documentation and whatever Corell and Tague decided to bring into that room, and she had very little control over any of it. What she did was drive to the harbor again. She walked the pier. The fishing boats were coming in for the evening, and the smell was specific and not unpleasant and very much like other places she'd been, other waterfronts in other countries, other times when she'd had a few hours of nothing to do and had stood near water and tried to let the day's accounting finish itself without her forcing it. There had been a man in her unit once, a long time ago, in a different version of her life, who'd said that the best medical decisions were made by people who could sit with uncertainty without letting it become noise. She had taken that seriously. She had tried to build that into herself. The uncertainty right now was whether the hearing was going to go the way hearings like this usually went, which was in favor of the physician and the institution, or whether something else was going to happen. She drove home. She made dinner, which she ate without tasting it. She went to bed at 10, which was early for her, and lay awake for about an hour thinking about nothing useful, and then slept. The morning of the hearing, she put on clothes that communicated competence without announcing it, drove to the hospital, and found Gordon waiting for her in the lobby. "Anything new?" she said. "Nothing I didn't already tell you." He handed her a folder. "Remember, measured, factual, no emotion. They're looking for instability." "I know how to be measured," she said. The conference room was the same one as before, which she supposed made sense. Marsh was there, and Fell, and Holt, and 2 board members she didn't know by name, but recognized by sight. Her documentation was in the folder. Gordon sat beside her. Holt looked comfortable, not visibly smug. He had better control than that, but comfortable in the way of a man who had set up the terrain and was waiting for the other party to realize it. Marsh opened the proceedings. He reviewed the incident report. He outlined the specific allegations, scope of practice violation, insubordination in an active clinical setting, unauthorized direction of nursing and surgical staff. He was polite about it, the way administrators were polite about things they'd already decided. Mara responded. She went through her documentation methodically. Vitals timeline, her clinical assessment, and the specific reasoning behind each decision. She was factual and she was precise, and she did not editorialize. Holt's rebuttal was smooth. He didn't raise his voice. He talked about professional hierarchy, about the risks of staff overstepping established protocols, about the dangerous precedent that would be set if the hospital condoned what had occurred. He was, she had to admit, very good at this. He had done it before. She was 2 sentences into her response when the conference room door opened. Not knocked. Opened. The woman who entered first wasn't Corell. She was older, with silver in her short hair, and a jacket that was civilian but cut like something else. And she moved like someone who was accustomed to rooms adjusting to her presence rather than adjusting to the room. Behind her came Corell. Behind Corell came Tague, carrying a laptop and an external drive. Behind Tague came a man in a hospital gown and non-skid socks, moving slowly, one hand on the doorframe for a brief moment before he straightened, and who should not by any clinical measure have been out of his bed. Marsh half stood. "I'm sorry. This is a closed administrative hearing. You cannot—" The woman in the civilian jacket set a folded document on the table in front of him. "Deputy Inspector General, Department of Defense, Officer Review Division," she said. "My name is Marion Vess. The patient currently in your ICU is the subject of an active federal protective action, and the proceedings of this hearing are material to that investigation. We have standing to be present." She looked at the document and then at Marsh. "That's the order. You can call the number on the bottom if you want to verify." The room was completely silent. Marsh picked up the document. He read it. His face went through several things in about 4 seconds. Holt was not looking comfortable anymore. The man in the hospital gown had made it to the chair that Tague pulled out for him, and he sat down carefully, the way someone sits when movement is costing them something but they're not going to show how much. He had dark eyes and a face that had seen a significant amount of weather, and when he was seated, he looked across the table at Mara with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Then he looked at Holt. "I understand," he said, his voice rougher than it might normally have been, "that you're the physician who managed my case." Holt straightened. "That's correct. What was my presenting blood pressure on arrival?" A beat. 94/60, following fluid resuscitation and transport. "And the primary intervention you made?" "Chest decompression, followed by surgical assessment. At what point did you identify the mesenteric arterial hemorrhage?" Holt's jaw moved slightly. "The surgical team identified—" "At what point," the man said again, with no additional inflection, "did you identify it?" The silence was different now. It had texture. Corell opened the laptop. On the screen was the trauma bay footage, already cued to a timestamp. She turned it to face the board members. "This is the operative footage from Bay 2 on the night of the 14th, she said. "The timestamp in the upper right corner is synced to the telemetry record. What you're going to see is a discrepancy between the events documented in the incident report and the events that actually occurred." Holt said, "I have to object to the introduction of—" "You can object," Vess said pleasantly. "This is a Defense Department investigation. Your objection is noted." The footage played. Mara watched it with the particular detachment of someone watching something they were inside of, from outside. She looked at herself in that footage and saw what she had felt at the time, but couldn't see from inside her own head. The specific quality of her movement, the directness of her hands, the way the team had oriented around her without anyone formally deciding to do so. She also watched Holt step back. She watched the moment it happened. The blood pressure on the monitor behind the table, her movement, his step backward. Clear, unambiguous. One of the board members, a woman named Aldridge, who Mara had never spoken to directly, leaned forward. The man in the hospital gown had not looked at the footage. He was looking at Mara. When the clip ended, he spoke. "My name," he said quietly to the room, "is not something I'm going to put in your records. But I'm going to tell you that the woman sitting across from me is the reason I'm sitting in this chair instead of in a drawer in your basement. I was conscious for approximately 40 seconds in that trauma bay before I lost it again, and in those 40 seconds I heard one voice that knew what it was doing. He looked at Holt. It wasn't yours. Holt opened his mouth. I'd think very carefully, Vess said without looking at him, about what you're about to say next. Holt closed his mouth. Marsh was reading the federal order again. He had the expression of a man who had come in expecting to sign one document and was now holding something significantly heavier. Mara's hands were flat on the table in front of her. She was not smiling. She was not doing anything that communicated triumph because it wasn't that, not yet, and possibly not ever, in the way those things were supposed to feel. What she felt was the same thing she always felt when a situation shifted from one configuration to another, a kind of recalibration, quick and unsentimentally practical. The board members were looking at each other. Holt was looking at the table. Gordon, beside her, had stopped writing. Carell was watching Holt with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment and recognized it when it arrived. Fell, the nursing director, finally spoke, and what she said was not what Mara had expected, which was, the clinical record submitted by Dr. Holt, the version on file, does it accurately reflect the events on that footage? Carell said, no, it does not. Fell looked at Holt. He looked back at her with the first expression she'd seen on his face all morning that wasn't controlled. Then Tague set a second file on the table and Carell said, this is the unedited telemetry from the operating room. There are 17 specific data points that contradict the incident report on file. We've marked them. She looked at Marsh. There is also a discrepancy between the draft version of the report, which was pulled from the hospital's internal server as part of our review, and the submitted version. Specifically, 3 passages were altered between 11:42 p.m. and 1:17 a.m. on the night of the incident. The room went somewhere very quiet and very still. And Garrison Holt, who had spent 30 years being comfortable in conference rooms, looked at the table in front of him and understood that the terrain he had set up was not, in fact, the terrain he was standing on. And Garrison Holt, who had spent 30 years being comfortable in conference rooms, looked at the table in front of him and understood that the terrain he had set up was not, in fact, the terrain he was standing on. The 17 discrepancy markers in Tague's file were color-coded. Not because anyone needed them to be dramatic, the data was dramatic enough on its own, but because federal documentation had its own logic, and the logic said that when you were presenting evidence of falsification, you made it impossible to look away from any individual point by making each one impossible to miss. Marsh picked up the file. He read the first page slowly, then the second. His face did not change in the way that faces change when information is surprising. It changed in the way that faces change when information confirms something the person was already afraid was true. Board member Aldridge had her reading glasses out now. The other board member, a man named Farrow, who had said nothing since the DoD team entered, had pulled his chair 2 inches closer to the table. Small movements. The kind that meant the room had shifted from performing a process to actually attending to something. Holt's attorney, a hospital-retained counsel, who had come in expecting to observe an internal administrative action and was now sitting in something considerably different, leaned toward his client and said something inaudible. Holt shook his head once, a small, tight motion. Vess waited until the room had finished reading. She had the patience of someone who did not need to perform authority because she actually had it. The draft version was accessed under Dr. Holt's credentials, Carell said when the silence had gone on long enough. The access log from the hospital's internal documentation server shows 3 logins between 11:42 and 1:17. The changes made in that window are highlighted in Appendix B. Those could be clerical corrections, Holt said. His voice was even. Give him that. They could be, Carell said. Except that the original draft accurately matches the trauma bay footage, and the submitted version does not. A clerical correction would typically bring a document closer to the clinical record. These alterations move away from it, systematically, in a direction that benefits one party to the incident. This is a federal matter now, Vess said to Marsh specifically. The incident report on file is evidence in an active investigation. I need to be clear about that before we go any further. Anything that happens in this room today, any action taken or reversed, becomes part of that record. Marsh set down the file. He looked at Holt. Holt looked back at him, and something passed between them that was not collegial. It was the look of two men recalculating the distance between them in a hurry. I think, Marsh said carefully, we should take a brief recess. Take whatever time you need, Vess said. We're not in a hurry. The hallway outside the conference room had a bench against one wall that was too narrow to be comfortable and a window at the far end that looked over the parking structure. Mara sat on the bench. Gordon sat beside her. The DoD team had remained inside with the board. The man in the hospital gown, whose name she still didn't officially know in any context she could use, had been helped back toward the elevator by Tague, moving slowly but steadily, and had looked at her once before he turned the corner. She hadn't been able to read the look. She'd filed it and let it go. That was not what I expected, Gordon said. No. The footage. He exhaled. If I'd had the footage going in, the whole shape of this would have been different. I didn't know they'd bring it. They didn't tell you? They told me they might be present. They didn't tell me what they had. She looked at the window. I didn't want to count on it. Gordon nodded slowly. He was the kind of lawyer, representative technically, but the thinking was the same. Who processed things by going quiet and then saying something precise? He was quiet for a while. The falsification piece is the thing, he said finally. That's not a scope of practice argument anymore. That's a different category entirely. I know. If the board acts on what's in that room, and if the DoD pursues the documentation issue separately, Holt is looking at Gordon. She said it quietly. He stopped. I know what he's looking at, she said. I've known the whole time. I just needed to stay out of the way of the process. He looked at her in a way that lawyers sometimes looked at people who said things that implied a longer view than the immediate situation seemed to require. How long have you been in rooms like this, he said. She almost smiled. Different kinds of rooms, she said. Same basic dynamic. He didn't ask her to explain that. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When the conference room door opened, it was Fell, the nursing director, who came out first, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had been quiet through an entire proceeding because she was thinking and had now finished thinking and arrived somewhere. Nurse Weston, she said, we'd like you back in. The room had rearranged itself, not physically, but in terms of who was oriented toward whom. Marsh was still at the head of the table, but he seemed smaller in his chair, which was a function of posture more than anything else. The board members looked like they'd been having a real conversation, which was distinguishable from a performative one by the specific quality of stillness people had after one. Holt's attorney had his briefcase open. Holt himself was looking at the middle distance. Mara sat down. Gordon sat beside her. Given the materials presented by the Department of Defense investigative team, Marsh began, with the careful diction of someone who had mentally rehearsed this sentence twice, and given the discrepancies identified between the incident report on file and the clinical record as confirmed by contemporaneous telemetry and security footage, this board finds that the documentation supporting the suspension of Nurse Weston is materially insufficient to sustain the disciplinary action. He paused. The suspension is lifted, effective today. Your badge will be reactivated, and you will be restored to your scheduled shifts. Beside her, Gordon exhaled through his nose. Mara said, and the nursing board referral? Marsh looked at Holt. The look lasted about 2 seconds and communicated the kind of institutional recalibration that took much longer than 2 seconds to actually execute. The referral will be withdrawn. Holt's attorney said something to Holt in a low voice. Holt gave a single short nod that was the nod of a man conserving every available unit of control. Additionally, Fells said, speaking for the first time with something that had weight behind it, the clinical record from the night of the 14th will be reviewed and corrected to accurately reflect the sequence of events as documented by the telemetry and the footage. That review will be conducted by the Quality Assurance Committee, not by the original documenting physician. She looked at Holt when she said the last part. And Dr. Holt is placed on administrative leave pending the hospital's internal review of the documentation discrepancies and their compliance with our charter obligations regarding accurate medical record keeping. Holt looked at her. She looked back. Something ended in that exchange, quietly and without ceremony. Vess said, from the corner where she'd been standing for the entire second half of the proceeding, "We'll be in contact with your legal office regarding the federal record correction. That process runs parallel to your internal review." She said it to Marsh, but it was meant for the whole room. "Thank you for your cooperation." The meeting ended the way things ended when there was nothing left to argue about, with the pulling together of folders, the brief exchanges of people who had been in opposition finding the exact minimum amount of acknowledgement required to exit the space with professional continuity. Holt left without looking at Mara. She didn't watch him go. She was thinking about the corrected record, about what it meant that it would now accurately reflect who had done what in that trauma bay, and about the fact that accurate records mattered beyond this room and this situation, that they mattered to every patient who came through that bay afterward, to every decision made based on what was in the chart. She thought about that more than she thought about winning. Gordon shook her hand in the hallway. "I'll be honest," he said. "I'm not sure I was going to get you through that without them." "Maybe not," she said. "You knew they'd come. I knew they might." He gave her the look again. "What did you do before this, Mara?" "I was a nurse," she said. "In a different place." She went home and changed out of the conference room clothes and back into something she could actually move in, and she sat at her kitchen table for a while with the window open and the harbor smell coming in off the water, and thought about what came next. What came next, practically, was returning to her shifts, seeing her colleagues, sitting in the cafeteria across from people who had watched her walked out and would now watch her walk back in, and navigating whatever that meant for the individual dynamics of a unit that had just been through a significant institutional rupture. Those things were real, and they were going to require attention, and she had enough experience with the aftermath of conflict to know that the resolution on paper and the resolution on the ground were two different timelines. She also thought about the man in the hospital gown. She thought about what it meant that he had gotten himself out of an ICU bed, against what had almost certainly been the strong advice of his care team, to attend an administrative hearing at a civilian hospital. She thought about what it took, physically, to do that 3 days post-operative from repair of a mesenteric arterial injury on top of 2 other gunshot wounds. She thought about the kind of person who decided that was the right use of the recovery energy they had. She knew that kind of person. She had been, in a previous version of her life, surrounded by them. She went back to work that evening. The shift started the way shifts started. Board check. Team handoff. The low-frequency noise of a functioning trauma unit settling into its overnight rhythm. Lynette was at the nurses' station when Mara came in and didn't make a production of it, just said, "Glad you're back," and handed her the overnight summary without editorializing, which was exactly the right amount of acknowledgement. Donna gave her a look that communicated everything a longer conversation would have said, and then went back to her charting. Felix, the newer nurse, looked like he wanted to say something and then looked at Mara's face and decided against it. Also the right call. She worked the shift. A chest pain that turned out to be reflux, a pediatric arm fracture, one incoming from a minor vehicular accident that needed observation but not intervention. Standard. The kind of night that reminded you why you did this work when the other kinds of nights made you wonder. At 3 a.m, she was updating a chart when her pager went off. Not the general trauma alert. Her pager. Personal page, room number, ICU, room 11. She stood at the nurses' station for a moment. Room 11 was where the man with no official name was recovering. She didn't go immediately. She finished the chart entry. She told Lynette she was taking a 10-minute break and walked to the elevator and went up to the ICU floor, where the night desk nurse, a young man named Ash, who was efficient and didn't ask unnecessary questions, told her that the patient in room 11 had requested a specific nurse and given a name. Her name. "He's not supposed to be paging anyone, Kyan," Ash said, with the mild exhaustion of someone who had already had this argument once tonight. "He pulled the call cord and told me he needed to see Weston from the trauma floor, or he was going to walk down there himself, and I believed him." "He would," Mara said. She went in. The room was dim. One overhead on low, the monitoring equipment providing its own ambient light, the kind of half-darkness that hospital rooms had at night that was neither restful nor clinical, but something in between. He was sitting up in the bed, which he shouldn't have been, but she registered immediately that it wasn't costing him as much as it had earlier in the day. He was recovering faster than the chart probably said he would. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down without being asked. "You should be flat," she said. "I've been flat for 3 days." 3 days after a mesenteric repair plus 2 other gunshot wounds isn't an argument for sitting up. "No," he said. "It's an argument for getting on with it." He looked at her. "I need to tell you something." "Okay." "I was conscious when you walked into that bay. Longer than I told the investigators." He said it plainly, like a report. "About 90 seconds. I heard the full exchange between you and the attending, the vital signs, the argument, the part where he told you to step back." She looked at him. "I couldn't move," he said. "I could hear. I knew what was happening. I knew what he was about to do, and I knew it was wrong, and I couldn't—" He stopped. A controlled stop, not an emotional one. Just someone who had encountered the edge of something they were choosing to move back from. "I need you to know that I was aware of what you did and why." She said, "You didn't need to get out of bed to tell me that." "No," he agreed. "That's not the only thing." She waited. "My name is Decker," he said. "Warrant Officer First Class Ren Decker, currently listed as inactive reserve, which is the cover story. I'm not going to tell you more than that right now, and I'm not going to explain what I was doing on the Aldrin access road because that's not something I can discuss in a hospital room." He looked at her steadily. "But I know who you are. Not the Harlow Memorial version, the other version." Her hands were still in her lap. "Who told you?" she said. "Vess ran the recognition when the flag triggered. Your biometrics are in the system, old system. The deployment records were supposed to be sealed, but nothing is actually sealed from the IG's office if they know where to look." He paused. "She briefed me yesterday. I already suspected from the trauma bay, but she confirmed it." Mara looked at the monitor. His heart rate was steady. 71, which was good for someone who had been in as much physical stress as he'd been in. "What do you want, Decker?" she said. Not unkindly, just directly. "Nothing you don't want to give." He shifted slightly and managed not to wince, though it was close. "I want to know if you're planning to stay at this hospital." "That's not what I expected you to ask." "Vess is going to offer you something," he said, "before she leaves Caldwell City. A position or a consultation or a way back in. I don't know the specifics. She didn't tell me the specifics. I think she was going to talk to you tomorrow." He looked at her. "I wanted you to hear it from a person first, not a briefing." She sat with that. "What's your read on it?" she said. "I think you've been doing this." He looked around the room, not with dismissal, carefully, the way a person looked at a place they were trying to understand. "And I think part of you has been waiting for something, and I don't think you entirely know what it is. That's a guess." "It's a reasonable guess," she said. "You don't have to go back," he said. "Whatever she offers, I'm not here to recruit you." "I know. I just wanted you to hear it as a person and not as an institutional proposal." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. They were two people who had been in similar enough situations to not need to perform anything for each other, and that was its own specific kind of shorthand. "Get some sleep," she said, and stood up. "Weston." He said it before she reached the door. She turned. "The OR footage," he said. "What you did in that bay. I've been in the field with medics who didn't move like that. Not many people move like that." "A few do," she said. "Yeah." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "A few do." She went back downstairs. She finished the shift. She wrote her notes. She drank bad coffee at 5 in the morning in the break room with Felix, who had apparently decided she was approachable after all, and had questions about a chest auscultation technique he'd seen her use twice that he couldn't find documented anywhere. She walked him through it. He asked good follow-up questions. She revised upward her opinion of him. She drove home at 7 in the morning, and at 9:15 there was a knock at her apartment door. Marion Vess was standing in the hallway in the same civilian jacket, with a paper coffee cup from the place on Mercier Street in each hand, and the expression of someone who was not there to waste anyone's morning. "Decker told you I was coming," Vess said. "He did." "Smart man." She held out one of the cups. Can I come in? Mara stood aside. Vess walked in, looked around the apartment with the brief professional scan of someone assessing a space, and sat at the kitchen table without being directed to it. She set her coffee down, put her hands flat on the table, and looked at Mara with the directness of someone who had built a career on not softening things unnecessarily. Before I say anything official, Vess said, I want to acknowledge something. What was done to you at this hospital? The incident report, the suspension, the nursing board referral, that was a deliberate attempt to permanently damage your professional standing in order to protect one physician's ego and liability exposure. And it very nearly worked. It didn't, Mara said, because we intervened, and we intervened because of Decker, and because the flag triggered on the intake system, and because Carell is thorough. She looked at her. That's a lot of contingency for a good outcome. Yes, Mara said, it is. The reason I'm here is not just the hearing. We were going to be here regardless of the hearing. Vess wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Decker's presence in Caldwell City was not coincidental. He was here on an operational matter that I'm not going to detail, but the short version is that there are other people involved in whatever brought him to that access road, and his injury is part of an active situation, not a completed one. Mara was still. We have a problem, Vess continued, that is specifically medical in nature, and specifically requires a combination of tactical field experience and clinical credibility that is not easy to find in the same person. The DoD has a short list of individuals with those qualifications. You are on that list, have been for some time. I left, Mara said. I left that work deliberately. I know. I built a life here. I know that too. Vess looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to give it up. I'm asking you to consult, specifically regarding Decker's case and the operational context around it. Specifically because there are 2 other individuals connected to the same situation who may need medical assessment in the next 72 hours, and the circumstances under which they need it are not circumstances that permit a standard clinical intake. Mara looked at her. 72 hours, she said. That's the current window. After that, the situation changes and we have different options. Vess paused. I need an answer in the next 12 hours because the logistics require advanced preparation and we're already inside a narrow timeline. Mara stood up and went to the window. The harbor was doing what it always did in the morning, catching the light, going about its business, indifferent to the specific weight of any individual decision made within sight of it. 2 other individuals. Active operational situation. 72-hour window. She knew what that meant. She had spoken that exact language for years. She knew what it felt like to be inside it and what it cost and what it was like to come out the other side. She had chosen to come out the other side and stay out. She also knew, because she was honest with herself in the specific way that people who'd survived the things she'd survived had to be honest, that the thing Decker had said last night was true. Part of her had been waiting. She didn't entirely know what for. Tell me about the 2 individuals, she said, still looking at the harbor. Vess opened her jacket and produced a thin folder. I can give you the medical parameters. Not the names, not the context. Mara turned around and took the folder. She opened it. She read the first page, then the second. Her expression didn't change, but her hands, which were usually steady, which she had trained to be steady in conditions that made most people's hands do things they couldn't control, tightened almost imperceptibly on the edges of the paper. Because what was on the second page was not a medical record. It was a photograph printed in black and white, taken at an angle that suggested a long-range lens, and it showed the access road at Fort Aldrin where Decker had been found bleeding in a ditch. And in the background of that photograph, standing at the tree line with their backs to the camera, were 2 figures in civilian clothes. One of them was facing slightly sideways, enough to see the jawline. Mara knew that jawline. She knew it because she had known the person it belonged to for 9 years, in a version of her life she did not discuss at Harlow Memorial Hospital or anywhere else in Caldwell City, a version of her life that she had closed the door on deliberately and had kept closed for 7 years. She closed the folder. She looked at Vess. When do we leave? She said. When do we leave? She said. Vess looked at her for a moment, not surprised exactly, but with the specific attention of someone who had expected resistance and was recalibrating. 4 hours, she said. I'll have Tague send you the logistics. Pack light. Mara nodded once, and Vess stood, picked up her coffee, and left the apartment with the same economy she'd brought in. The door closed. The room was quiet. Mara stood at the kitchen table and looked at the closed folder for a long moment without touching it. Then she went to her bedroom and started packing. She was good at packing light. She had spent years learning how to reduce what she carried to exactly what was necessary and nothing else, which was a skill that transferred poorly to civilian life but never fully left. She packed for 4 days, which was either enough or it wasn't. And she set the bag by the door and made coffee and sat with it and thought about the face in that photograph. 9 years was a long time. Long enough to build something new. Long enough to stop reaching for old reflexes every time a situation triggered them. Not long enough, apparently, to make the jawline in a surveillance photograph mean nothing. She finished the coffee. She rinsed the cup. She sent a text to Donna that said covering something back in a few days, which was the kind of message Donna would understand better than it read on the surface, because Donna was perceptive in the way that 22 years in a trauma unit made people perceptive. Donna wrote back 4 minutes later. Be careful. 2 words. Exactly right. The vehicle that picked her up was a government-issue SUV with tinted windows and no markings, driven by Tague, who said nothing for the first 20 minutes of the drive north along the coast road toward Fort Aldrin. Carell was in the passenger seat. Vess was not in the vehicle. Mara sat in the back with a second folder on the seat beside her that she hadn't opened yet. The 2 individuals in the photograph, she said, after the silence had run its course. Where are they now? That's what we're trying to determine, Carell said without turning around. The photo was taken 6 hours before Decker was found on the access road. The individuals in the frame have not been located since. Do you know if they were with him or... We don't know their relationship to Decker's situation. That's part of what we need to assess. Mara looked out the window. The coast road ran along a ridge above the water, and the morning light was hitting the ocean at an angle that made it look like hammered metal, which was beautiful in the impersonal way that things were beautiful when you weren't in a position to enjoy them. The person on the right in that photograph, she said. What name are you running them under? Carell paused for half a second. We have 2 possible matches, neither confirmed. Give me one. Another pause. Tague glanced in the rearview mirror once and then looked back at the road. Rourke, Carell said. Lena Rourke. Former Army, 18 Delta, medically separated in 2019. Mara said nothing. You know that name, Carell said. Not a question. I know the person, Mara said. Or I did. How well? Well enough. She picked up the folder from the seat beside her. Tell me what you actually need me to do when we get there. Fort Aldrin's medical facility was a 2-story building that sat behind the main administrative block, functional and under-resourced in the specific way that military medical facilities at non-combat installations tended to be, adequate for the routine, underprepared for anything else. The officer who met them at the gate had the stiff courtesy of someone who'd been told to cooperate without being told why, which was an uncomfortable position, and he wore it visibly. They were taken to a briefing room that smelled like old coffee and dry erase marker, where a map of the area around the Aldrin access road was pinned to a corkboard with 3 color-coded markers. 1 red pin at the location where Decker was found. 2 yellow pins further northeast at the edge of a tree line that bordered a restricted maintenance corridor. A base intelligence officer named Dantry ran the briefing. He was efficient and humorless, which suited the situation. The yellow pins are where we found blood evidence, he said. 2 separate trails, both heading into the maintenance corridor, both going cold about 400 meters in. We don't know if the individuals who left those trails exited through the northern perimeter or are still in the corridor, and we don't know their current medical status. Blood volume? Mara said. First trail. Moderate. Enough for concern, not enough for immediate critical status. Second trail. He paused. More significant. Based on the pattern and volume, the individual was moving but losing at a rate that would become critical within 1 to 2 hours of the time the evidence was deposited. When was the evidence deposited? Estimated 17 to 21 hours ago. Mara did the math, and didn't say what the math said out loud. Everyone in the room had already done the same calculation. We have 2 medical personnel on standby, Dantry continued, but they don't have field trauma experience beyond standard training. The maintenance corridor is not accessible by vehicle. Any medical intervention would need to be carried in on foot. Carell looked at Mara. I need to know what I'm walking into, Mara said. The operational context. Not all of it. I understand there are clearance issues, but enough to make good decisions if the situation changes. Dantry looked at Carell, a look that asked permission without asking it. Carell nodded. Decker was running a surveillance operation against a domestic asset trafficking network using Fort Aldrin's supply infrastructure as a transit route, Dantry said. He was not alone. There were 2 other operatives embedded in the corridor. The operation was compromised approximately 24 hours before Decker was found. Source of the compromise is currently under investigation. The other 2 operatives, Rourke and a second individual using the designator Marsh, no relation to your hospital administrator, were last in radio contact at approximately 2200 hours the night Decker was shot. Marsh, Mara said. That's the designator, not the name. Correct. She looked at the map. 400 meters of maintenance corridor. 2 people possibly inside it, one of them losing blood at a rate that was either already fatal or close to it, depending on whether they'd been able to slow it themselves, and a compromised operation that meant someone on the outside might still be actively looking. I need a kit, she said. Full trauma, say 2 sets of everything, large bore IVs, chest seals, tourniquet supply, hemostatic gauze, pressure bandages, and I need a radio on a frequency that's not the one the compromised operation was using. We can have that ready in 40 minutes, Dantry said. Make it 30. Matt. She went in with a base security specialist named Okafor, who was 28 and had the physical competence of someone who trained seriously and the anxiety of someone who understood the stakes without being experienced enough to have burned through the anxiety yet. She didn't hold it against him. Anxiety was appropriate. The people who went into situations like this completely calm were either very experienced or not paying attention, and she'd learned that only one of those categories was actually safe. The maintenance corridor was a service road that had been decommissioned and left to naturalize. Gravel under overgrowth, concrete drainage structures, the skeletal remains of a chain-link fence that had given up any structural ambition years ago. The tree line was dense on both sides. The light under the canopy was dim and greenish and played tricks with distance. Okafor tracked the blood evidence on the ground. Mara tracked the surrounding terrain. Old habit. You watched the ground when you were following someone injured, but you watched the edges when the situation that injured them might not be resolved. The first trail went left at a fork in the collapsed road. This way, Okafor said. Wait. Mara looked at the fork, at the ground, at both trails. The briefing said the larger blood volume was on the right. I know. She crouched. She looked at the right-hand trail, at the specific pattern of the blood drops. Not a drag pattern, not a stumble pattern, but a controlled movement pattern from someone who was injured and walking deliberately, spacing their steps. Then she looked at the left trail, which was lower volume but had a different character entirely. Someone split them up, she said. The right trail is the decoy. Someone who was functional enough to think clearly sent one person right to draw attention while the other went left. Okafor looked at the ground. How can you... The drop spacing on the right is too regular. Someone in serious hemorrhagic distress doesn't maintain that cadence. They stagger. She stood. The critical patient went left. The person on the right was buying time. He absorbed that. Which do we follow? Left, she said. And we move. The left trail went deeper into the corridor, curving with the natural depression of an old drainage channel. After 300 meters, it began to show signs that were not ambiguous. Heavier blood, an improvised pressure wrap made from what looked like torn shirt material tied around a branch that had been used and discarded. Someone had stopped here, tried to deal with something. At 360 meters, behind a collapsed concrete drainage structure that created a low shelter on 3 sides, she found them. Lena Rourke was sitting up against the concrete with her back straight, which Mara recognized immediately as the posture of someone keeping themselves conscious through will rather than physical condition. She was pale, sweating, with both hands pressed against her left side where the improvised wrap was saturated through. Her eyes were open, and they tracked Tamara with the specific quality of eyes that were working harder than they should need to do that. Beside her, unconscious and wrapped in Rourke's jacket, was the second operative, Marsh Designator, a lean man in his mid-30s with a tourniquet on his right thigh, applied correctly, which meant Rourke had done it before she ran out of the functional capacity to do much else. Rourke looked at Mara for a long moment. "Weston," she said. Her voice was rough and quiet and completely unsurprised. "Of course it's you." "Don't talk," Mara said, already down beside her, cutting the saturated wrap away. "How long on the tourniquet?" 7 hours, give or take." 7 hours was a problem. Long tourniquet time meant ischemia, meant the limb below was in trouble, meant the moment they released it, they were going to manage a reperfusion crisis with limited equipment in a drainage ditch in a decommissioned service corridor, which was not the ideal context. "Is the arterial bleed controlled on your side?" she said. "Slowed, not controlled." Rourke's jaw tightened as Mara's hands found the wound. "There's a fragment in there. I could feel it. Didn't have anything to get it out." "I know. I've got it." She had Okafor holding light and handing instruments with the focused obedience of someone who had decided to be useful and was executing on that decision. "The tourniquet first. Marsh goes first." "He's been out for 4 hours," Rourke said. "I know." She looked at the unconscious man. His color was bad, but not incompatible with 7 hours of tourniquet and blood loss. His breathing was shallow and regular. She palpated his thigh above the tourniquet, feeling for what she needed to know. "I'm going to release this in stages. When I do, I need you to maintain pressure on your own wound. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Tell me if you can't." "I will." She looked at Rourke for 1 second, at the face she hadn't seen in 7 years, which was different in the ways faces were different after 7 years, and the same in the ways that mattered for the next 30 minutes. This was not the time, and they both understood that, in the way that people who'd operated together understood things without needing them stated. She went to work. The tourniquet release was staged over 12 minutes, which was the longest 12 minutes available in the current situation. She watched the distal pulse, watched the coloration change, watched for the hemorrhagic cascade that didn't come as dramatically as it might have. Rourke had applied it well, the vessel hadn't fully disrupted, and the tissue damage was significant but not catastrophic. Marsh regained partial consciousness at minute 8, which was a good sign. He was confused and didn't speak coherently, but he tracked a sound and withdrew from painful stimulus, which was enough. Rourke's wound was more complicated. The fragment was small, irregular, metallic, lodged against the lateral aspect of the fourth rib, and not in a position that was immediately life-threatening, but was absolutely in a position that would become life-threatening with movement and time. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze and applied a pressure dressing and told Rourke in flat, clear terms exactly what it meant and what the next 2 hours needed to look like. "Understood," Rourke said. "You're not going to argue about any of it." "I said understood, Weston, because the last time I gave you medical instructions, you decided they were suggestions." A pause. Then, quietly, "That was a different situation." "It was," Mara said. "And this one is also not a suggestion." Okafor had radioed for extraction. The team came in from the northern perimeter with a stretcher and 2 more security personnel, and the logistics of getting 2 injured people out of a decommissioned maintenance corridor without exacerbating either of their injuries occupied the next 40 minutes entirely, which was fine because it meant there was no space for anything else. She rode back to the Aldrin Medical Facility in the extraction vehicle with her hand on Rourke's wrist, monitoring the pulse, watching the pressure dressing, thinking 3 steps ahead the way she'd always thought 3 steps ahead in the field. Rourke looked at the ceiling of the vehicle. "You're different," she said. "I've been doing this for 3 years. Harlow Memorial, I know." A pause. "You actually like it?" "Yes," Mara said. "Huh." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "I heard what happened there, with the hearing." "From who?" "Decker. He talks when he's recovering. It's annoying." She shifted slightly and caught herself. "The surgeon falsified the record?" "Yes. And they only found out because of the federal flag on Decker's intake." "Yes." Rourke was quiet again. Then, "That's a hell of a lot of contingency." "That's what Vess said." "Vess is right about more things than she lets on." A pause. "What happened to the surgeon?" "Administrative leave, pending review." Rourke made a sound that communicated what she thought about the adequacy of that outcome, and then was quiet because talking was costing her energy she needed elsewhere, and she was practical enough to stop when it did. Garrison Holt's administrative leave lasted 4 days before it became something else. Mara wasn't at Harlow when it happened. She was at Fort Aldrin, managing Rourke's surgical referral to the regional military hospital at Trentham, working the logistics of transferring Marsh to a facility with the appropriate clearance level for his case, and doing all of it with the specific focused energy of someone who had returned to a mode of operating that was both deeply familiar and more complicated than she'd let herself think it would be. But she had a phone, and Gordon called. "The state medical board moved on the referral," Gordon said. "Not Holt's referral against you. Just months. Bachamsi. That's been formally withdrawn. The board's own referral, opened after the DOD presented the falsification evidence to the hospital's legal counsel. They moved independently? They had to. Once the hospital disclosed the documentation discrepancy to their malpractice insurer, which they were legally required to do, the insurer notified the board directly. The board doesn't wait for hospital timelines when there's a falsification allegation from a federal source. What's the action? Emergency suspension of privileges pending formal review. Not just at Harlow, statewide. He cannot operate, cannot admit patients, cannot see patients in a clinical capacity until the review is complete. Gordon paused. And it gets more specific. The DOD separately filed a federal complaint related to the falsification of a medical record that constitutes evidence in an active federal investigation. That's a criminal referral, Mara, not a licensing matter. She was standing outside the Fort Aldrin Medical Building in the morning sun, watching a maintenance crew work on something across the yard. "How's he responding?" she said. His attorney issued a statement saying he intends to cooperate fully with all reviews and that the documentation in question reflected a good faith effort to accurately capture a complex clinical event. Gordon's voice had the careful flatness of someone reading a document they found professionally offensive, which is a position that is difficult to sustain against a 17-point federal discrepancy analysis, but that's his attorney's problem. What about the clinical record? The actual record from the night of the 14th? Quality Assurance finalized their correction yesterday. The official record now accurately reflects the sequence of events as documented by the telemetry and the footage. Your clinical assessment, your intervention, the team response, it's all there, attributed correctly. She let that land. It was a strange thing, accurate documentation. Not dramatic, not visible, not the kind of outcome that made itself felt the way that other things did. But she had spent a lot of years understanding that the record was the thing that outlasted everything else. Outlasted the moment, outlasted the individuals involved, outlasted whatever was convenient or protective or self-serving in the aftermath. The record was what the next person relied on. The record was what kept the next patient alive or didn't. Getting it right mattered beyond her. "Thank you, Gordon," she said. "There's one more thing." He said it in a way that made her wait. The hospital board met last night, full board, not just the subcommittee. Marsh, Hospital Administrator Marsh, not the other one, requested a formal meeting. A pause. "They're going to offer you something when you're back. I don't know the specifics. Patricia Fell reached out to me informally and said to tell you the board wants to have a real conversation." "Okay," she said. "That's all? Okay? What do you want me to say, Gordon?" "I don't know. Something that suggests you understand this is an unusual situation." "I understand it's an unusual situation," she said. "It's still okay." She went back inside. Usat. She was back in Caldwell City 4 days later. She had slept intermittently and eaten whatever was available and had not, for 5 consecutive days, thought very much about what she was going back to. That was the thing about operational focus, Gio. It crowded out everything that wasn't immediately relevant, which was useful and also a way of deferring things that eventually needed attention. She stopped at her apartment first. She showered, changed, ate actual food. She sat by the window and looked at the harbor and let the deferred things catch up with her at their own pace. Decker was still at Harlow, nearly 2 weeks post-operative and progressing well. Rourke was at Trentham. Marsh, the operative, was somewhere she didn't have clearance to know. Vess had not formally offered her anything before they parted ways at Fort Aldrin. She had said instead, "Think about what you want the next version to look like," which was a different kind of offer, less specific, more honest, and harder to answer. She thought about it. She went to Harlow the next morning in her own clothes, not scrubs, because she hadn't been told to come into work. She'd been asked to come in for a meeting, which was a different thing. She went to the fourth-floor administrative suite, which was a part of the building she'd been in exactly twice before, and was shown into a conference room where Reuben Marsh sat with Patricia Fell and 2 board members, including Aldridge. The meeting had a different quality than the hearing. The hearing had been institutional, procedural and formal, and structured around a predetermined outcome. This one was something closer to honest, in the particular uncomfortable way that institutional honesty expressed itself, which was slowly and with significant hedging. Marsh said that the board recognized the harm done by the suspension and the referral, and that the hospital accepted responsibility for the failure to scrutinize the incident report with appropriate rigor before acting on it. He said this carefully and in language that Mara recognized as having been reviewed by a lawyer. But underneath the reviewed language there was something genuine, or at least something that wanted to be genuine. Fell said more directly, "We failed to support a clinical judgment that was correct in favor of a professional hierarchy that was wrong, and a nurse who saved a patient's life was treated as a liability. That should not have happened, and it cannot happen again." Then she said, "We want to offer you the lead trauma nurse coordinator position. It's a senior clinical role. You'd have direct oversight of trauma protocol compliance, staff training, and the ability to flag clinical concerns through a formal review channel that doesn't require going through the attending physician on duty. It's a new position. We're creating it partly because this situation made clear we didn't have it." Mara sat with that for a moment. "Who does it report to?" she said. "Quality assurance and nursing leadership jointly," Fell said. "Not to the trauma attending." That was significant. She noted it. "I'll think about it," she said. Marsh looked like he'd expected a faster answer. Aldridge looked like she respected the pace. "Of course," Fell said. "Take whatever time you need." She left the hospital and walked to the harbor. Not the pier this time, just the edge of it, where the road ran along the waterfront and you could stand and look at the boats coming and going without committing to the full walk. She thought about what a lead trauma coordinator could actually do. Not what the title meant or what the office looked like, or how it would appear on a resume, what the work would be. The protocol oversight, the training, the channel for flagging the kind of things she'd seen on the night of the 14th, before it got to the point it got to that night. She thought about Rourke, in a hospital bed in Trentham, who had said, "You actually like it with genuine surprise," as if that were unexpected, as if liking what you'd built in the quiet life were a thing that needed explaining. She thought about Vess's question, which wasn't really a question. What do you want the next version to look like? She was still thinking about it when her phone rang. Gordon. She picked up. "There's a development," he said. She could hear from his voice that it was not a good one. "Tell me." "The federal criminal referral on Holt," he said. "His attorney filed a response this morning. They're challenging the standing of the DOD evidence on the grounds that the patient's identity is classified, and the chain of custody for the federal documentation was not disclosed to the defense in advance of the referral. It's a procedural challenge, not a substantive one, but if it succeeds, it could delay the criminal proceeding significantly." He paused. "That's not the development." She waited. "The development is that Holt submitted a second statement to the state medical board this morning, independent of his attorney's procedural challenge. In the statement, he acknowledges altering the report, but he characterizes it as a response to what he calls a broader pattern of insubordinate and destabilizing conduct by nursing staff at Harlow Memorial, and he names 2 other incidents, prior incidents, predating the night of the 14th, in which he claims you overstepped your clinical scope. A beat. Both incidents are documented, both predate your arrival at Harlow. He's presenting them as a pattern. She went very still. "What incidents?" she said. "I don't have the specifics yet. His statement only summarizes them. But he's submitted supporting documentation to the board, and the board is required to consider it as part of their review." The incidents he's describing, if they predate my time at Harlow, they're from your prior employment record, wherever you were before Harlow. She looked at the harbor. The water was doing what it always did. The boats were going where they were going. The light was breaking itself apart the way it always did. Prior employment record. She had submitted a record to Harlow that listed 12 years of nursing experience and a gap between 2009 and 2016 that read simply as prior medical service and that nobody had ever asked her to elaborate on. Whatever Holt had found, or had been given, was not from the Harlow period, which meant someone had accessed something that should not have been accessible, or someone had given it to him. And the only way the record from that period of her life was accessible to a civilian physician in a licensing dispute was if someone with access had chosen to surface it. The operational context, the compromised operation. The source of the compromise that Dantry had said was currently under investigation. She thought about the procedural challenge, the timing of it, filed the same morning as Holt's second statement. She thought about the photograph of the access road and the two figures at the tree line. She thought about whether those two things were connected, and the answer she arrived at was not a comfortable one. "Gordon," she said, "I need you to find out exactly what documentation Holt submitted to the board, not the summary, the actual documents, and I need to know who provided them to him. I can request disclosure? How fast?" 48 hours minimum. The board, get it faster. Her voice was level. It was always level. "Please. It matters." She hung up and looked at the water for one more second, and then she called a different number. One she had memorized and not stored, because some numbers you memorized precisely because storing them was the wrong choice. Carell picked up on the second ring. "The documentation Holt submitted to the medical board this morning," Mara said without preamble. "Prior incident records from before my time at Harlow. Someone gave them to him. Those records are not publicly accessible." A silence that lasted exactly long enough to confirm what Mara already suspected. "I know," Carell said. "You know because you found out this morning, or you know because it's connected to what you've been investigating." Another silence. Longer this time. "Mara," Carell said, and the use of her first name was its own kind of answer. "I need you to come in." "Where?" "The Aldrin Liaison Office. Tonight." A pause. "The source of the operational compromise. We have a name, and it's not someone outside this situation." The harbor was doing what it always did. Mara's hands were very still. "Who?" she said. And Carell said a name that Mara had heard in a conference room 3 weeks ago, in a context that had seemed entirely unrelated, spoken by a man who had been performing calm so consistently that nobody in that room had thought to look at what was underneath it. The name Carell said was Reuben Marsh. Mara stood at the waterfront for 3 seconds after the call ended, which was the amount of time it took for the information to finish settling into the architecture of everything she already knew. Then she put the phone in her pocket and started walking. Not to her car. Not yet. She walked the length of the waterfront road once, at a pace that looked ordinary, because she needed 30 seconds of physical movement to run the sequence backward and check it against what she'd seen, what she'd heard, what she'd attributed at the time to different causes. Marsh had been in every institutional moment. The initial suspension meeting, present, presiding. The hearing, present, receiving the DoD documentation in real time with an expression she had read as overwhelmed administrator and was now reading differently. The board meeting that followed, present, ostensibly making amends. He had been in every room. She thought about the procedural timeline, the operational compromise that Dantry said preceded Decker's shooting. Decker had been shot the night of the 14th. Mara had been suspended the morning of the 15th. The suspension had removed her from the hospital and from proximity to Decker, who had been admitted there, for 9 days. 9 days during which a compromised operative was recovering in an ICU, and the person controlling the administrative process that kept his primary field recognizing contact away from him was apparently the same person who had compromised the operation. She didn't know the full shape of it yet. She knew enough. She got in her car and drove to Fort Aldrin. Booked out. The liaison office was a converted administrative annex at the back of the base's legal services building, unremarkable from the outside, which was the point. Carell met her at the door. Inside, Teague was at a table with 2 monitors running and a phone on speaker that was currently silent. Vess was standing at the window. Mara sat down without being directed to. "Tell me what you have," she said. Vess turned from the window. The source of the compromise was identified through communication metadata, a sequence of encrypted transmissions originating from within a 500-meter radius of Harlow Memorial Hospital, timed between 72 and 48 hours before Decker was shot. The transmissions were routed through a civilian relay, but the encryption signature matched a pattern we'd been tracking in connection with the asset trafficking network Decker was surveilling. "You're saying someone at or near the hospital was feeding information to the network?" "We're saying someone near the hospital was using a method consistent with a source who knew what they were doing." Vess looked at her directly. "We didn't have a name until this morning, when Holt's attorney filed the procedural challenge, and simultaneously, Holt filed his supplementary statement to the medical board. Both filings reference documentation from a sealed personnel record, sealed at a federal level." "Which means whoever gave Holt that documentation had federal access," Mara said, "or access to someone who had federal access." Carell pulled up a document on the nearest monitor. "We ran Marsh's background this morning. His administrative career is standard, but 9 years ago he had a consulting contract with a logistics firm called Aldrin Transit Partners. That firm was a subsidiary of a company that we now know was one of the early infrastructure fronts for the network Decker was investigating." "He knew what was moving through Fort Aldrin's supply corridor," Mara said. "We believe so. We believe the connection was dormant for years. He took the hospital position, built a legitimate career, and the network didn't need him until they needed to know whether the operative admitted to their facility was a threat to their operation." Mara thought about Decker in the ICU, about Holt walking in to introduce himself as the doctor who'd managed the case, about the way Marsh had processed the hearing with the expression of a man managing a headache. "He used Holt," she said. "That's our assessment. Holt filed the incident report and created the mechanism that removed you from the hospital. Whether Holt knew why Marsh wanted you removed, or whether he was simply a useful instrument, we don't yet know. But the sequence of events, your suspension, Decker's isolation in the ICU, the operational compromise of the corridor, they're not coincidental. What's Marsh's current status?" "He's at the hospital," Teague said. "He came in this morning as normal. He doesn't know we have his name." Mara looked at Vess. "I want to be in the room when you take him," she said. Vess looked back at her. "That's not standard." "I know." A pause, not a long one. "The medical board disclosure," Vess said. "The documentation Holt submitted, your sealed personnel records. They're going to need to be formally addressed regardless of what happens with Marsh. The board can't unreceive them." "I know that too. Which means part of what has to happen today is that your record gets disclosed on your terms, not his." Vess said it carefully, watching her face. "The board is meeting again this afternoon to review Holt's supplementary submission. If we're going to get ahead of this, we need to move now." Mara was quiet for a moment. She had spent 7 years being deliberate about what she carried forward and what she set down. The record from before Harlow existed because she'd existed in it. She wasn't ashamed of it. She had never been ashamed of it. But she had chosen the quiet life consciously, and exposing that record meant the quiet life became the footnote, and the other life became the headline. And she had private feelings about that which were real and which she was going to have to set aside. "Let's go," she said. Gone. They went to Harlow in 2 vehicles. Carell and Teague went directly to the administrative suite. Vess went with Mara, which was a choice that meant something in terms of who Vess believed needed the weight of her presence in which room. They went to the medical board session first because that was the tighter timeline. The board had reconvened in the same conference room. 4 members, including Aldridge, plus the board's legal counsel, and a liaison from the state licensing office, who had driven up from the regional office that morning specifically to review the supplementary submission. Holt was not present. His attorney was. The attorney opened by reiterating that the documentation submitted that morning was intended to establish a pattern of conduct and that the board should consider the full clinical history of the individual in question before reaching conclusions about the incident of the 14th. Mara sat across the table from him. Vess sat beside her. The attorney looked at Vess with the expression of someone who kept encountering a variable he hadn't planned for. The documentation submitted this morning, Vess said to the board, references personnel records that are federally sealed. The submission of those records to a state licensing body without federal authorization is itself a legal violation, separate from the content of the records. She set a letter on the table, a physical letter, not a printout, on a letterhead that the board's legal counsel visibly recognized. That letter authorizes the disclosure of the relevant portions of Nurse Weston's prior service record in this proceeding. It also formally requests that the board note the provenance of the records submitted by Dr. Holt, specifically that they were obtained through unauthorized access to a federal personnel system, and that the method of that access is currently under federal investigation. The licensing liaison looked at the letter, and then at Mara. Mara looked back at him. She was not going to perform humility about what was in that record. She was not going to preface it or contextualize it in the way that people sometimes preface things they were privately proud of in order to seem appropriately modest. She was just going to let it be what it was. Vess spoke for approximately 8 minutes. She described Mara's service record in the terms it existed in: 12 years of active and reserve military service, the last 6 as a senior medical officer embedded with special operations units in operational theaters, advanced surgical training obtained in field conditions that no civilian residency program replicated, a commendation record that she summarized in 2 sentences and did not elaborate on because elaborating on it would have taken considerably longer than the available time. The room was quiet. Aldridge, who had been the most attentive board member across every proceeding, said, "The incident report that triggered this review characterized Nurse Weston as overstepping her clinical scope. Given what you've just described, is that characterization accurate?" "No," Vess said. "In your assessment, was the intervention she performed within her competence?" "The intervention she performed was within the competence of a combat surgical officer with her training and experience. Whether it maps precisely onto the civilian scope of practice framework is a definitional question. Whether it was the correct clinical action is not." The licensing liaison said, "The board's mandate is the civilian scope of practice framework." "I understand that," Vess said. "I'm not asking you to change your framework. I'm asking you to apply it to an accurate factual record, not to the falsified one that initiated this review." A silence. Holt's attorney said, "My client's supplementary submission was made in good faith, using records he obtained through a channel that is now under federal investigation," Vess said pleasantly. "Your client's good faith is a matter for a different proceeding. This one is about the accuracy of the clinical record, which has been corrected, and the standing of the original referral, which was generated by a physician who altered documentation to conceal his own clinical errors." She looked at the board. "The referral should not have been filed. The basis for it no longer exists. I'd ask the board to act accordingly." The board asked for 15 minutes. They took 11. When they came back, the chair, a man named Osgood, who had been almost entirely silent through every proceeding Mara had attended, said that the referral filed against Nurse Mara Weston was formally closed without finding, that no notation would appear on her licensing record, and that the board would separately review the conduct of the referring physician in relation to the submission of improperly obtained documentation to a state licensing body. Holt's attorney closed his briefcase. Mara said, "Thank you," and meant it toward the board and not the attorney, and the distinction was clear. In the administrative suite on the 4th floor, the other part of it was happening. Mara knew the broad shape of it from what Corell had told her on the drive over. Federal agents, a warrant, a conversation that Reuben Marsh had not anticipated having that morning when he'd come into work and sat at his desk and presumably believed that the documentation strategy had bought enough time and enough confusion to keep the walls standing. She wasn't there for it. She found out the shape of it afterward, in pieces, from Corell and from Fell, who had been pulled into a secondary meeting she hadn't been prepared for and had emerged from it with the specific expression of someone who had just discovered something fundamental about a person they'd worked alongside for 4 years. What happened in that suite was not dramatic in the way that confrontations were sometimes dramatic. Marsh had not shouted or denied or made a scene. He had, by all accounts, sat very still for a long time when the warrant was presented and then had asked to call his attorney, and then had said nothing further. The stillness was the thing that stayed with the people who were there, the absolute quality of it, like a man who had been waiting for a door to close and had finally heard it. The federal agent secured his workstation and his files. His access was revoked. He was escorted from the building not through the public areas, but through the service corridor, which was the kind of detail that felt deliberately merciful and was probably just logistically practical. Fell took over administrative operations on an interim basis, effective that afternoon. Mara heard about it in the lobby. She was sitting on the bench near the main entrance, the same bench she'd sat on the night of the 14th while waiting for the elevator, the same narrow, uncomfortable bench that looked out across the front atrium when Fell found her. Fell sat down beside her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The lobby moved around them, visitors, staff, the normal traffic of a hospital doing its work, indifferent to the specific weight of what had just occurred on the 4th floor. 4 years, Fell said finally. He sat in that office for 4 years. Yes, Mara said. I hired him. Fell said it without drama, just fact. I interviewed him and recommended him to the board and thought he was exactly what the administrative operation needed. He probably was, functionally. People are usually more than one thing. Fell looked at her. That's a generous reading, Fell said. It's an accurate one. It doesn't make what he did less serious. Fell was quiet for a moment. Then, the position I offered you, lead trauma nurse coordinator. I was going to come back to you about it. I know. I'm not rushing you. Fell looked at the atrium. I want to tell you that the offer was genuine before all of this. And it's still genuine after it, but I also want to tell you that I understand if things look different to you now. Mara thought about that. Things did look different, not in the way Fell might mean, not more tarnished, not more complicated in a way that made leaving feel right. Different in the way that things looked when you'd seen their full shape for the first time and were deciding how you felt about it. Can I have until tomorrow? Mara said. Of course, Fell said, and stood, and put her hand briefly on Mara's shoulder before she walked away, an uncharacteristic gesture from a woman who ran professionally cool, and Mara registered it as the thing it was. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that some things couldn't be fully addressed through institutional language. Decker was being discharged that afternoon. She found out from Ash at the ICU desk, who told her with the specific combination of clinical efficiency and personal warmth that was Ash's default register. She went up. He was actually dressed, civilian clothes, the first time she'd seen him in anything other than a hospital gown, sitting on the edge of the bed signing discharge paperwork with the careful attention of someone who had decided that if he was going to be doing something, he was going to do it correctly. He looked like a person instead of a patient, which was both obvious and not obvious when you'd only known someone horizontal. He looked up when she came in. Weston, he said. Decker. She leaned against the doorframe. They're actually letting you out? I may have had input into the timeline. I'm sure the care team loved that. They communicated their reservations clearly. He signed the last page and set the pen down. I heard about this morning. Marsh. And the board. He looked at her. Both of them. News travels. Vess keeps me informed. A pause. How are you doing with it? It was a direct question, and he asked it the way he asked everything, without hedging, without the social framing that made questions like that easier to dismiss. She considered giving him the short version and decided against it. I'm doing with it the way I do with most things, she said. I'm letting it settle, and then I'll decide what I think. That's a good method. It's the only one that works for me. She looked at the discharge paperwork on the bed. You heading back to Aldrin? Eventually. Taig's driving me to Trentham first. A pause that had a different quality than his usual pauses. Rourke's there. I know. She asked about you. Mara looked at the floor for a moment. Is she going to be all right? The fragment's out. The repair went well. She's going to be restricted for 6 weeks and she's going to hate every day of it, but she'll be fine. He looked at her. She said to tell you that the instructions were not actually as annoying as you made them sound. Mara almost smiled. That's as close to gratitude as Rourke gets. It really is. He stood carefully with the controlled movement of someone whose body was still making the transition from repaired to functional. He picked up the bag beside the bed. Bess told me what she offered you, the consultation. She told you the details? Enough of them. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to tell you to take it. That's not my position. But, he considered, I've worked with a lot of people, in the field, in medical contexts, in the specific situations where both of those things overlap. I've worked with people who were technically excellent and people who were instinctively right and occasionally both. You're both. He said it without ceremony, as a report. Whatever you do next, that doesn't go away. It goes with you. She looked at him. Get some rest, Decker, she said. You too, Weston. She walked him to the elevator, not because he needed it, but because it was the direction she was going anyway. And when the doors opened and he stepped in, he looked at her once with the uncomplicated look of one person who had been through something significant with another person, and then the doors closed. She accepted the position the next morning. She called Fell at 8:15 before the administrative office officially opened because she'd been awake since 5 and had finished thinking somewhere around 7 and saw no reason to wait. Yes, she said when Fell picked up. A brief silence, then, good. I have conditions. Tell me. The reporting structure you outlined, quality assurance and nursing leadership, not trauma attending, that's non-negotiable. The protocol review process needs to include a mechanism for nursing staff to flag concerns without going through the physician on duty, and that mechanism needs to be documented and visible, not theoretical. Agreed, Fell said without hesitation. And I want the training program rebuilt from the ground up. What we have now is adequate for routine. It's not adequate for what actually comes through that trauma bay. How long would that take? 3 months to design, another 2 to implement properly. I'll make sure you have the resources. A pause. Anything else? Mara thought about it. No, she said. That's it. She drove to the hospital. She picked up her badge from the security desk, not the old one, a new one, reprinted with the updated title under her name, and put it on its lanyard and went to work. The shift started the way shifts started. Board check, team handoff, the overnight summary from Lynette, who handed it over with the same economy as always and then said quietly, "Lead coordinator looks right on you," and moved on before Mara could respond, which was the correct pace for that kind of thing. Donna was at the nurse's station with her coffee and her resigned competence in her 22 years, and when Mara came in, she said, "Here you're redesigning the whole training program." Word travels fast. This is a hospital. Word travels at the speed of light and arrives with commentary. Donna looked at her over the rim of the cup. Good. It needs it. Felix appeared at Mara's elbow at some point in the mid-morning with a question about a protocol discrepancy he'd noticed in the chest trauma documentation, which was exactly the kind of thing she'd built the new reporting mechanism to catch. She walked him through it. She made a note. She told him it was a good catch and meant it, and watched him stand slightly differently afterward, which was not nothing. The morning progressed. At 11:15, while she was reviewing the draft of the new trauma triage protocol she'd started outlining the night before, her phone showed a message from a number she'd stored in the last week under a first name only. Fragment out. 8 solid food. 6 weeks minimum of Weston's instructions. Tell her she was right. She set the phone down and looked at the draft protocol and allowed herself briefly the quiet satisfaction of being right about something that had mattered. Rourke would recover. Decker was out. Marsh was in federal custody, and the investigation into the network was proceeding with the kind of documented momentum that didn't stop once it started. Holt's emergency privilege suspension had been extended pending a full malpractice review and the federal criminal referral, and his attorney's procedural challenge had been denied by the federal magistrate the previous evening on the grounds that the chain of custody argument did not withstand scrutiny when the documentation had been accessed through an unauthorized channel in the first place, a neat circularity that resolved the way those things resolved when the underlying facts were clear. None of it was clean. That was the thing she kept coming back to when she let herself think about it in full. The accurate record existed now, but Holt had spent 2 weeks under emergency suspension while his patients were redistributed to colleagues and his professional reputation went through the specific kind of public exposure that permanently changed the texture of a career. And the question of whether that was proportionate or disproportionate to what he had done was not one she was able to answer simply because she wasn't simple about it. He had falsified a record to protect himself. He had done it deliberately and specifically. And some part of her also understood that the night of the 14th had been the worst professional moment of his life. The moment where his assessment had been wrong and someone he dismissed had been right. And the record falsification was the response of a man who couldn't survive that fact in the open air. That didn't excuse it. It explained it in the way that most bad choices explained themselves, which was as a function of a person being unable to tolerate something true about themselves. She wasn't interested in his suffering, but she wasn't interested in pretending it wasn't a human situation either, because pretending things weren't human situations was how institutions made the same mistakes repeatedly. That was the thing about the training program she was rebuilding, not just the clinical protocols, though those mattered, and the deficiencies were real and fixable. The deeper thing was about what happened in the gap between clinical hierarchy and clinical accuracy, about what it cost patients when the person who knew the right answer was not the person who had the institutional authority to act on it, about the systems that were supposed to close that gap and the ways they reliably failed. She had been the person in that gap. She had been there on the night of the 14th, and she had made a choice that cost her 9 days of her career and nearly cost her the career itself. And she would make the same choice again, not because she was reckless or self-sacrificing or any of the things that people said about people who did things like that, but because the math had been clear, and the math was always clear when you stripped away the hierarchy and the ego and the liability management and got down to the actual question, which was, what does this person need right now to stay alive? The answer to that question didn't care about credentials. It didn't care who had the most impressive title in the room, or the longest history in the institution, or the highest position in the professional hierarchy. It only cared about being right quietly, without announcement, without the structures of authority validating you before you acted. That was the thing nobody trained people to do. That was the gap. And it was a gap that appeared everywhere, that humans organized themselves into hierarchies and then forgot that hierarchies were tools for coordination and started treating them as proxies for competence. She was going to spend the next several months building a training program that taught people how to sit in that gap without flinching. It wasn't a small ambition. She was aware of that. At 2 p.m, she was in the trauma bay for the first real call of her new role, an incoming MVA, 2 patients, 1 pediatric, the kind of thing that tested team coordination more than individual clinical skill. She stood at the edge of it, rather than the center of it, watching the team work, calling 2 interventions that she identified before the attending did, and delivering them as questions rather than corrections, so that the attending, a competent younger physician named Saraiva, who was 3 years out of residency and receptive in the way that people were receptive when they hadn't yet learned to protect their ego at the expense of the patient, could hear them and decide and own the decision. He made the right calls. Both times. Afterward, in the corridor, Saraiva said, "The pediatric airway. I would have gone for the larger tube." "I know. What made you go smaller?" "You asked what the weight-adjusted estimate was, and I ran it, and the smaller tube was right." "You had the information," she said. "You just needed to get to it in sequence." He looked at her. Not with the look that Holt had given her, the look that computed threat and responded with dismissal, but with the look of someone filing something useful. "Is that what the new training program is about?" "Part of it," she said. "I want to be in that program," he said. "I'll put you on the list." She finished the shift at 7 p.m. and walked out through the emergency department the same way she always walked out, badge on its lanyard, bag over one shoulder. Lynette was at the station. Felix was charting. Donna had gone home an hour ago. The board showed 4 incoming, nothing critical, the ordinary engine of the place running the way it ran. She went through the sliding doors into the evening. The air outside was the air of Caldwell City in the early fall. Harbor salt and the distant diesel smell from the fishing boats and something cooler underneath it that meant the season was shifting. She stood on the sidewalk outside the entrance for a moment, not moving, just letting the day finish itself. She thought about what Decker had said. It goes with you. He was right, and she had always known it was right, And the reason she had needed to hear it from another person was not because she'd forgotten, but because some things needed to be said in the presence of someone else to become fully real. The years she'd spent in the field, the work she'd done, the people she'd been responsible for, and the decisions she'd made under conditions that didn't permit hesitation. None of that had left when she left. She'd carried it into every shift, every assessment, every moment in the trauma bay where she knew something and had to decide what to do with the knowing. The quiet life was real. She had built it deliberately, and she had meant every part of it. But the quiet life didn't erase what came before it, contained it. And what the last 3 weeks had done, in the way that crisis sometimes did this, was make the container visible, show her exactly what she was holding and why and what it was worth. She walked to her car. She was going to go home and eat dinner and sleep a full night if the pager allowed it, and tomorrow she was going to come back and keep building the thing she was building. Not because anyone had finally recognized her, though the record was now accurate, and the title was now on her badge, and the board had said what boards said when they understood they'd made a serious mistake. But because the work was the work, and the work was what she'd always been, and the name on the badge had never been the part that mattered. What mattered was what happened in the room when the alarms went off and the pressure dropped, and everyone in the space was making a fast calculation about whose voice to follow. She intended to be in that room for a long time. The harbor was doing what it always did as she drove home. Dark now, lights from the fishing boats out on the water. The city going about its evening around her with the complete indifference of a place that didn't know and didn't need to know what any individual person inside it was carrying. She had spent a lot of time looking at that harbor. She had stood at its edge and done the kind of accounting that didn't have a clean ledger, measuring what she'd left against what she'd built, measuring what the quiet life cost against what it gave, measuring the version of herself that had walked out of a military life deliberately against the version that had walked into a trauma bay on the night of the 14th and made a call that nearly ended her career and had instead, through a sequence of contingencies that she was not going to romanticize, ended up revealing something true. The truth was simple, and she had always known it. She was very good at keeping people alive. She had been good at it in places and conditions that most people would not believe she had survived, and she was good at it now in a trauma bay in a Port City hospital where the coffee machine was inconsistent and the overnight shifts were long and the work was ordinary enough on the good nights that you could forget, briefly, what it meant to do it well. She wasn't going to forget. She pulled into her parking space, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. The harbor was out there, past the buildings and the roads, going about its permanent business. The boats were going where they were going. The light was gone from the water now, replaced by the flat dark of a coastal night. And somewhere in the direction of Fort Aldrin, there were people doing work that would never be fully public, under conditions that didn't permit acknowledgement. And one of them had 3 healing wounds and a discharge summary and a long drive back to a base where his presence was listed as inactive reserve. She thought about Rourke eating solid food in a hospital bed in Trentham. She thought about Felix catching a protocol discrepancy and standing differently when she told him it was a good catch. She thought about Saraiva going for the smaller tube. She got out of the car. She walked upstairs. She made dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with the window open and ate it and tasted it, which was not nothing, and then she pulled the draft training protocol toward her and worked on it for an hour before she decided she'd done enough for one day. She went to bed. She slept. She was back at Harlow Memorial at 6:45 the next morning, badge on, board checked, coffee in hand, standing at the edge of the trauma bay where the overnight team was running the last 90 minutes of their shift, and the day was just beginning to assert itself through the high windows. Gray light, early, the specific quality of a morning that hadn't decided what it was going to be yet. It was the same bay, the same lights, the same antiseptic smell underneath the other smell, the one that never entirely left. She was the same person she had always been. That was the thing that nobody who had dismissed her had ever understood, and that nobody who understood her had ever needed to be told. The work was the same work it had always been. She picked up the first chart of the morning and went to work.